All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling South African politics.
Sounds exciting.
It is. And we've got this document here, sort of like our roadmap for this journey.
Oh, cool. Like a study guide.
Exactly. And, what's really interesting is it doesn't just focus on the present day.
Oh.
Yeah, it takes us way back,
Mm.
like all the way back, to give us a real sense of how South Africa's political system, evolved into what it is today.
I like it. A bit of historical context. Always helpful.
Totally. So that's where we're going to start, like before colonialism even entered the picture.
Okay. So pre-colonial South Africa.
You got it. The document digs into all these political structures that were already in place. And, it's pretty amazing how diverse and complex they were.
I bet. It's not something you hear a lot about.
No, not really. For example, it talks about this thing called the Pitso.
Pitso.
Yeah, it was like a council among the Sotho people.
Yeah.
They'd make decisions through discussion and consensus.
Interesting. So like a very participatory form of governance.
Yeah. And what struck me was that emphasis on consensus building. It's like it's woven into the fabric of South African political culture, even today.
Yeah, I can see that. It makes you think about how those historical traditions might still be influencing things today.
Absolutely. So we've got this foundation of pre-colonial systems, right?
Yeah.
But then things obviously change dramatically when the Dutch arrive, followed by the British.
Right. Colonialism throws a wrench in the works.
Big time. And the document doesn't shy away from, highlighting how those external forces really shaped the South African state.
Makes sense. You can't talk about South African politics without acknowledging the impact of colonialism.
For sure. And one of the key concepts it introduces is this idea of the Republican spirit.
Republican spirit?
Yeah, it emerged during those early colonial days. Think about it. The early settlers, they were all about self-governance, right?
Yeah, pushing back against those external controls,
Right.
wanting to determine their own destiny.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that this Republican spirit, it kind of reemerged in the 1990s.
Oh, wow. During the transition to democracy.
Yep. It's like history coming full circle, like an echo from the past.
It's wild how these historical threads can weave their way through time and influence events centuries later.
Totally. Okay, so we've got this backdrop of pre-colonial systems, the impact of colonialism, and then the document throws this other element into the mix, the emphicane.
The emphicane. Refresh my memory on that one.
Okay, so it was this period of intense warfare and migration in the early 1800s. It really shook up the political landscape.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. But I never really connected it to the bigger picture of South African politics.
Yeah, it's often overlooked, but it was a pivotal moment. It led to this major power shift. You had some groups, like the Zulu, becoming much stronger, while others were decimated.
Wow, so it really reshaped the balance of power in the region.
Yeah, it had these long-lasting consequences, influenced the development of states like Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, like a ripple effect.
So basically you're saying we can't understand modern South Africa without understanding the emphicane.
Exactly. It's all connected.
I'm starting to see that. It's like piecing together a puzzle.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so before we move on, let's do a quick recap. We started with those pre-colonial systems, the emphasis on consensus.
Right, like the Pitso we talked about.
Yep. Then we looked at colonialism, the introduction of that Republican spirit.
Which surprisingly popped up again later on.
And then we threw in the emphicane, that game changer of an event.
It's a lot to take in, but it's fascinating to see how these seemingly disparate pieces actually fit together.
Right, it's all part of the story. Okay, now let's zoom in a bit on those pre-colonial chiefdoms. The document goes into some really interesting detail about their political structures.
Like, how are they organized? What were their hierarchies like?
Exactly. And it turns out there was a lot of variation. One thing that jumped out at me was this figure, the Big Induna.
Big Induna. Okay, I haven't heard that one before.
So it seems like they held this really unique position, combining the authority of a king with the responsibilities of a judge.
Interesting. So like a ruler who also serves as the ultimate arbiter of justice.
Yeah, pretty much. A pretty powerful position.
Yeah, I bet. And it makes you think about how different cultures approach the whole concept of power and governance.
For sure. And even the way they handled leadership succession was really diverse. Sometimes it was hereditary, like father to son.
Okay, that makes sense. Kind of like a monarchy.
But in other cases, councils and public opinion actually played a role in choosing the next leader.
Wow, that's pretty progressive for pre-colonial times.
Right. It challenges our assumptions about how things worked back then. It shows that there were all these different approaches to governance within South Africa.
And it makes you wonder how those different traditions might have influenced the development of the country as a whole.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this tapestry of pre-colonial systems. Then colonialism comes in and shakes things up. And to top it off, you have the Mfecane throwing everything into disarray.
Quite the turbulent history so far. What happens next in this political saga?
Well, out of all this complexity, the South African republics emerged. You know, Transvaal, Orange Free State, Natal.
Ah, right. I'm starting to see how those pieces fit into the timeline.
Yeah, and these republics, they developed certain features that would have lasting consequences. They kind of set the stage for what would eventually become apartheid.
Okay, that's getting into some heavy stuff. I'm all ears.
Oh.
Tell me more about these republics and how they paved the way for apartheid.
Well, the first thing to understand is that voting rights, the franchise, it was severely restricted in these republics.
Oh, so right from the start, we're seeing exclusion.
Exactly. It was mainly limited to the white population.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of black South Africans, they were excluded from participating in the political process.
Wow, so the seeds of inequality are being sown right there, right from the beginning.
Right. And on top of that, they had this system called trusteeship for the non-white populations.
Trusteeship. What was that all about?
Well, it sounds kind of nice on the surface, right? Like they're looking out for these people.
Right.
But in reality, it was a way to maintain control and limit their rights.
It's like they're sugarcoating oppression, using language to mask what's really going on.
That's a great way to put it. And this part of the document really encourages us to think critically, to see past the rhetoric, and understand the underlying reality of these systems.
Definitely. Words can be powerful tools for manipulation.
For sure. So we're seeing how these historical events, these choices that were made, they had these huge consequences down the line. They shaped the trajectory of South Africa for generations.
It's a sobering reminder of how the past can cast such a long shadow on the present.
Absolutely. So we've gone from those diverse pre-colonial systems through the chaos of the Mfecane to the establishment of the republics with their restricted voting rights and this idea of trusteeship.
What a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're just getting started.
We are. We're on the edge of a major turning point in South African history.
Where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this story?
Well, next we'll delve into the 20th century. We'll see how South Africa grapples with the rise and fall of apartheid. That's where things get really intense.
I can imagine. And I bet there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that period. Lessons that are still relevant today.
Absolutely. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in South African history.
I'm ready when you are. All right, so we left off talking about those early republics, with their limited voting rights and the whole trusteeship system. They really laid the groundwork for apartheid.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to see how those early decisions had such a huge impact down the line. But now we're moving into the 20th century. Things are starting to shift.
Big time. This is where we see the dismantling of apartheid and the restructuring of the entire South African state.
Yeah, talk about a turning point. It must have been a pretty intense period.
It was. And this part of the document really digs into the factors that led to the demise of apartheid.
Okay, so what were the things that finally brought that system crashing down?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was this whole confluence of internal and external pressures. Like on the home front, you had rapid urbanization happening.
So cities are growing, more people are moving in.
Exactly. And it wasn't always planned or well managed. So you have this strain on resources, infrastructure, and then at the same time, you have this growing unrest.
People are fed up.
Totally. Resistance movements are gaining momentum. People are demanding change. They've had enough of the injustices of apartheid.
So you have this pressure cooker situation building up within South Africa itself. But what about the outside world? What was the international community doing about all this?
Well, they were becoming increasingly critical of apartheid. Sanctions were imposed. South Africa was facing condemnation from all corners of the globe.
So they're being isolated on the world stage.
Yeah, becoming a pariah state. And what's really interesting is that even the Cold War rivals, the U.S. and the USSR, they found common ground in opposing apartheid.
Wow, even those two. That's saying something.
It really shows how untenable that system had become.
Okay, so with all this pressure mounting, both from inside and outside,
Yeah.
how did South Africa actually start to transition away from apartheid?
Well, it was a super complex process. It wasn't just about dismantling the old system. It was also about negotiating a new one, creating a future where all South Africans could live together in peace and equality.
I can imagine the challenges involved in bringing all those different sides together, trying to bridge those divides.
Absolutely. And the document highlights how important these key figures were, like Du Toit, Gaggiano, Wenzil Slabbert.
Do those names ring a bell?
They were really instrumental in initiating dialogue and pushing for change. They recognized that a negotiated solution was the only way forward.
Kind of like pioneers, paving the way for this massive shift.
Exactly. And their efforts, combined with all that internal and external pressure, they led to the Herrera Declaration.
Herrera Declaration. Remind me what that was all about.
So it was a pivotal document that laid out these key principles for a democratic South Africa.
Okay, so you've got these individuals pushing for change, the nation is yearning for something different, and now you have this Herrera Declaration like a roadmap for the future.
Yeah.
But how did they actually put those ideas into action?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The transition and negotiation process was incredibly complex.
I bet. So many moving parts.
Yeah, but the document breaks it down into phases, which makes it easier to understand how it all unfolded.
Okay, walk me through those phases.
So it all started with what they call talks about talks.
Just talks.
It sounds kind of funny, but it was basically preliminary discussions just to establish the ground rules for the actual negotiations, setting the stage.
Okay, so testing the waters.
Right. And then came the bilateral talks between the government and the ANC, which eventually led to Nelson Mandela's release from prison and the unbanning of political organizations.
Wow, that's huge. It sounds like they were finally starting to make some real progress.
They were. And from those early talks came these key agreements. The Groot Sure Minute, the Pretoria Minute.
What do those agreements do?
Well, they address some of the big issues, like releasing political prisoners, allowing exiles to return, stuff like that, paving the way for more substantive negotiations down the line.
Laying the groundwork.
Exactly. But, even with all this progress, violence was still a major concern.
Yeah, I mean, the country was still deeply divided.
Right, and that's where the National Peace Accord comes in. It was this huge effort to try to curb violence, to create a more stable environment for these negotiations to actually happen.
You can't build a future when everything's on fire. Right.
Exactly. The peace accord was absolutely crucial for laying the foundation for a more peaceful, democratic South Africa. It created the conditions for the next phase, multi-party negotiations.
So it's not just the government and the ANC anymore. More voices are coming to the table.
Right. And now you have all these different parties, all with their own interests and perspectives, trying to hammer out this plan for the future.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare. How did they even manage to get everyone on the same page?
Well, that's where CODESA comes in.
CODESA. Okay, I've heard that before.
It stands for the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. It was a major milestone. Think of it as this big forum where all the key players came together.
So like a giant meeting of the minds.
Yeah, pretty much. To debate, negotiate, try to find some common ground.
Sounds intense.
Yeah.
What were the big outcomes of CODESA?
Well, one of the most significant was the Record of Understanding.
What did that do?
It established the framework for a government of national unity.
The Government of National Unity. What's that?
So even though the ANC was pretty much guaranteed to win the first democratic elections, they agreed to form a government that included other political parties.
So it's like a grand coalition, everyone working together.
Yeah. It was a huge compromise aimed at ensuring a peaceful transition and preventing any backlash from those who might feel excluded.
It's amazing that they were willing to put their own political ambitions aside for the greater good of the country.
It really speaks volumes about their commitment to building a united, democratic South Africa.
So CODESA wraps up, and then what?
Then comes the establishment of the Constitutional Assembly.
Ah, the Constitution. That's the big one, the rule book for the whole system.
Exactly. And this part of the document wants you to understand the process of drafting that new Constitution.
Okay, tell me more.
So it wasn't just some top-down process. They really tried to make it inclusive with significant public participation.
So regular people had a say in what went into the Constitution.
Absolutely. They held public hearings, received tons of submissions from citizens. It was a truly collaborative effort.
That's awesome. It really gives the sense that they were trying to build this democracy from the ground up.
Exactly. And this participatory approach really helped to ensure that the new Constitution reflected the will of the people.
That's so important for building a sense of ownership and legitimacy.
Right. Okay, so we've gone from the demise of apartheid to these complex negotiations all the way to the creation of this brand new constitution.
It's been a long road, but they finally reached that turning point.
They did. And now the real work begins.
What do you mean?
Well, now it's about making democracy actually work in practice. Building the institutions, fostering the culture, everything that's needed for a truly thriving, resilient democracy. And that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up our exploration of South African politics.
Absolutely. We've come a long way, haven't we?
We have. From those pre-colonial systems, through the apartheid era, all the way to the birth of a new constitution.
And now it's all about seeing how that democracy actually functions in the real world.
Exactly. So how does it work? How do they make it all come together?
Well, that's where we shift gears a bit. From the historical foundations to the actual mechanics of governance. And this last chapter in the document, it really tries to give you a solid understanding of how democracy operates in South Africa.
Okay, so lay it on me. How does it all work?
Well, it starts by diving into different theories of democratic development. And one of the key takeaways is that democracy, well, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah, I can see that. What works in one country might not work in another. Different contexts, different histories.
Exactly. And the document emphasizes this idea that democracy is a contested concept.
Contested? What does that even mean?
It means there's no single definition that everyone agrees on. It's constantly evolving, being debated, reshaped.
So it's not just some static thing. It's a living, breathing process.
Exactly. It's dynamic, it's messy, it's always changing.
That makes sense. Okay, so if it's so hard to define, what are some of the core elements that we usually see in democratic systems? Like, what are the building blocks?
Well, you've got the fundamentals, right? Free and fair elections, where citizens have a genuine choice.
Yeah, that seems pretty basic.
It is. Then there's the separation of powers. Making sure that no one branch of government becomes too dominant. Checks and balances.
Right, so no one can just run roughshod over everyone else.
Exactly. And of course, you've got to have the rule of law, meaning everyone is equal before the law, regardless of their position or status.
Okay, so those are the ideals, the principles.
Yeah.
But then the document also talks about this concept of political legitimacy.
Right. And that's huge, because a government can have all the right structures and institutions in place, but if the people don't believe in the system, if they don't see it as legitimate,
it's not going to work.
Exactly. It's about more than just having democracy on paper. It's about earning the trust and confidence of the people.
Especially in South Africa, right? After decades of apartheid, where most of the population was excluded.
Absolutely. Building legitimacy for that new democracy was essential.
Makes sense. Now, there's this other concept that the document digs into. Democratic consolidation. What exactly is that all about?
So consolidation is about making democracy stick, making it resilient, so that it can withstand challenges, crises.
So it's not just about that initial transition, it's about making sure it lasts.
Exactly. It's a long game. And this chapter really tries to get you thinking about what contributes to that consolidation or what might hinder it.
So how do you measure that? How do you know if a democracy is truly consolidated?
Well, that's the tricky part. There are different perspectives on it. Some experts focus on the political competition. Are there viable opposition parties that can challenge the ruling party?
Keeps things interesting.
Yeah.
And accountable.
Exactly. Others look at the strength of institutions, like an independent judiciary, a legislature that can effectively check the executive branch.
So it's about that balance of power again.
It all comes back to that. And it's also about fostering a democratic culture. Respect for the rule of law, individual rights, all that good stuff.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is. But it's essential if you want to build a democracy that actually thrives. And this chapter really wants you to grapple with those questions. Think about the state of democratic consolidation in South Africa, what progress has been made, what challenges remain.
Okay, so we've explored some of those big picture ideas about how democracy functions.
Yeah.
But the document also gets into the specifics of how South Africa's government is structured, right?
It does. Starts with the separation of powers, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting that South Africa has a system of partial separation. It's different from, say, the U.S. system.
Okay, I'm curious, how's it different?
Well, in the U.S., there's a very strict separation between the branches of government, legislative, executive, judicial. But in South Africa, there's more overlap, particularly between the executive and the legislature.
Interesting.
Yeah, and remember, the president is elected by parliament, so there's this built-in connection there.
Right, right. Makes sense.
And this chapter wants you to think about the implications of this system. Does this partial separation make things better, or does it create problems?
Okay, so let's break it down.
Hmm.
What about the judiciary? What's their main role in all this?
So their primary responsibility is to uphold the Constitution. They're the guardians, making sure everyone plays by the rules. They interpret the law. They make sure that the other branches of government are staying within their constitutional bounds.
So they're like the referees.
Exactly. And they have this power of judicial review, which means they can strike down laws or actions that they deem unconstitutional.
Wow, they can actually overturn laws. That's a lot of power.
It is, but it's a crucial power. It's what allows them to safeguard the rights of citizens and uphold those democratic principles.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the legislature? What's their role?
The legislature is all about making laws. And in South Africa, they have a bicameral parliament, which means it has two houses, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces.
Right. I remember we talked about that earlier. The National Assembly, they're the ones who are directly elected by the people, right?
Yep. They're responsible for passing most of the legislation. Then you have the National Council of Provinces, which represents the interests of the provinces at the national level. They play a specific role in considering legislation that affects the provinces.
Okay, so you've got these two houses, each with its own role to play.
Exactly. And this chapter wants you to think about how effective they are. Are they truly representative? Do they hold the executive accountable?
Good questions. Now, what about the executive branch? The president and all that.
Right. So the executive branch is responsible for implementing the laws that the legislature passes. And basically, they run the day-to-day affairs of the country.
It's a big job.
It is. It involves everything from national defense and foreign policy to education and healthcare. This section really wants you to grasp how the executive branch is structured, how it functions in relation to the other branches.
Okay, so they're the ones who actually make things happen. They take those laws and put them into practice.
Exactly. They tackle those real-world challenges that the country faces.
Makes sense. But it also seems like there's a lot of potential for, abuse of power.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why the document encourages you to think about that balance of power between the executive and the other branches. Is there enough oversight? Are there mechanisms in place to prevent things from going sideways?
Checks and balances are key.
Absolutely. And remember, it's not just the national government calling the shots. South Africa also has provincial and local governments that play a crucial role.
Right. So it's not just top down. There's that local element as well.
Exactly. It's about bringing government closer to the people, allowing for more localized decision making. And they're supposed to work together, in a spirit of cooperative governance. That's one of the key principles of the Constitution.
It sounds like a pretty complex system, but hopefully it's effective in making sure that everyone's needs are met. Okay, so we've covered the different branches, separation of powers, the role of provincial and local governments. Is there anything else we need to know about?
One more thing. The document highlights these institutions called Chapter 9 institutions.
Chapter 9. What are those all about?
So these are institutions that were specifically created to protect and strengthen democracy in South Africa. They're independent of the government, and they have this mandate to hold the government accountable.
So they're like the watchdogs, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Precisely. And one of the most well-known is the public protector. They have the power to investigate complaints of government wrongdoing, maladministration, abuse of power, stuff like that.
So they can go after anyone, even high-ranking officials.
Yep. They've been involved in some pretty high-profile cases, too, like the investigation into the allegations of improper spending on President Zuma's private residence.
No one is above the law.
Exactly. And that's what makes these Chapter 9 institutions so vital for democracy. They ensure that the system works as intended and that those democratic principles are upheld.
Wow. So it's been quite a journey, huh? From pre-colonial beginnings all the way to the complexities of modern governance, it really shows you how much South Africa has gone through.
And how much it's achieved. I mean, to go from apartheid to this vibrant, albeit imperfect, democracy, it's pretty remarkable.
It is. It just goes to show that change is possible, even in the face of enormous challenges.
It gives you hope, doesn't it?
It does. It shows the power of resilience, the importance of fighting for what you believe in, and the constant effort required to build a just and equitable society. And that's what makes learning about South Africa so fascinating. It's a story of struggle, transformation, and ultimately hope.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into South African politics. We hope you've learned a thing or two and maybe even feel inspired to dig a little deeper on your own. Thanks for joining us.